Hello and welcome to this video. This is going to be episode 1 of the speedrun, the educational speedrun that I do for the Benko Gambit. I'm going to be playing from the rating range of 600 on chess.com and the rapid rating pool, all the way up to a 2000 plus rating at that point. This particular episode, though, being the first one, is going to focus on games played between the rating range of about 600 all the way up to 800. Future videos will probably focus a little bit more on less than a 200 point gap. Maybe they'll kind of get lower to a 100 point gap. It just kind of ends up that the early stage of this speed run in the kind of 6 to 700 rating range, I didn't really come across that many people playing d4 on move number 1. Whereas the higher rated we get through this speed run, the more likely we'll face against opponents that are playing d4 on the first move of the game. So that being said, there's 3 different games in this video that I played. I do explain my thinking process through each of the games. The reason I'm using this particular opening for the Benko Gambit is because I did create a Chessable course on the website chessable.com. The name of the course was the Benko Gambit from Theory to Practice. And so I'm going to be playing this entire repertoire throughout this educational speedrun video series, explaining my thoughts, talking about what I'm thinking about in the positions, how to punish opponents' mistakes when they're making them in these games that we see. And so hopefully you'll enjoy the games here, as well as the insight that I'm able to bring to you as you watch them. And yeah, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the first game. All right, so we're in our next game here. Our opponent starts off with the move d4, playing against Advice 3, maybe is what their username is going for. Rated 627 from South Africa. I actually went to South Africa back in 2009, I believe. Yeah, 2009. That was a very cool experience. I got to do a safari in person and see all the different animals you'll usually see at the zoo, but out in the wild, which is very cool. Okay, this opponent goes for a4 on move number 2. I think here the best approach in a case like this, usually we're going to focus on playing a Benko Gambit approach, but if our opponent's playing some really, really silly looking stuff, they're just pushing a pawn on the complete edge of the board. I'm just going to go for... I think the most solid move is most likely just going to be d5, just, equalizing the space in the center and kind of asking white what the silly move a4 does. I think we'll stick at least a little bit here with some Benko Gambit-esque play. c5 is a potential option in a case like this as well. So let's go for c5. Let's keep it in the Benko Gambit style. Our opponent takes the pawn. Let's go for e6. We're going to regain the pawn relatively soon. If they go for b4, we'll play a5 to chip away at that pawn on b4. Bishop e3 is an option to guard the pawn. Against that, probably we'll go like knight to a6 or something like that to regain the pawn. Okay, they do play bishop e3 to hold on to the pawn. They're not going to be able to hold on to the pawn very long, though. Here, I think the simplest option is probably just to play the move knight to a6 to re-win or regain the pawn that's on the c5 square. The big issue that white will kind of face in this position is that the bishop on e3 is not very well placed. It is blocking this pawn on e2, and that's usually not a great situation for white. It's going to be a little bit hard for them to develop the light square bishop because the pawn on e2 is blocked. So white plays the move b3. Let's just go ahead, I think, and take the knight, or take the pawn back with the knight. Could also have taken with the bishop, but I don't really want to be in a rush to help white trade off their kind of misplaced bishop. If they want to trade it off for the knight, as they're doing here, that's totally fine. Now we have a pair of bishops. We have 2 central pawns compared to our opponent's 1 central pawn. We have a lead in development. This is already a very pleasant position for us. I'm pretty happy with the outcome of the opening so far. So white goes knight c3. I think here white is going to run into very big trouble with a particular tactic that we can execute here. So I might actually recommend here, if you want to pause the video, see if you can find the best way for black to play. Technically, there might be 2 moves that work in this position, but they'll both kind of, tie hand in hand to one another. So the best way to play in this position is a combination of bishop to b4 and queen to a5, both of these attacking the knight on c3 that's pinned. I don't know if it really makes a big difference which move you play first. White's going to have to use their queen or their king to defend the knight regardless, and whichever one we do first, we'll do the other one second. So I think I will probably just use the queen first. Yeah, I suppose so. We'll use the queen first. Might as well develop a new piece in the process. White's going to have to play queen to d2 or queen to d3. And against either one of these, bishop to b4 is going to be a big problem. There's also going to be some knight to e4 ideas that we can take advantage of the knight on c3 being pinned. In this case, they use the queen to block. I think we'll just continue with the move bishop to b4. And there's really nothing white can do about the knight on c3 being pinned and piled up on. This is one of the big issues of them having played the move b3 a little bit earlier, because now the knight on c3 is less secure. So now we're just going to win the knight. If it moves, we'll take the queen. And once we win the knight, so in this case, yes, we will capture the knight. White doesn't have any tricks down here. We've got the pawn on d7 defended. So we're up the knight. Queen's hit. Probably I'll try to slide or kind of wiggle my queen into the a3 square. If you can imagine the queen on a3 giving a check, the king would have to move to the b1 square, and then we would be able to deliver checkmate with queen to b2. So I think I should just prioritize this, quite honestly. I don't think I need to bother castling or developing or anything like that. I think queen to b4 is going to be a sufficiently big problem. This isn't really like playing for tricks or playing for hope chess or anything like that. I am just legitimately threatening checkmate in a way that's very, very difficult for white to deal with. Probably the best move is to move the king so that queen a3 is not a check. If the king's on b1, I cannot play queen a3, because then the bishop on c3 would hang. In this case, though, white does not recognize the threat that I have. And yeah, we're going to just execute on it. Queen a3 check, king moves, queen to b2 is going to be checkmate next move at this point. So they don't really have any other move available. We'll let them take the chance to move. Okay, so queen b2 or queen a1. I'm just going to go for b2. And we do deliver the checkmate in this position. Okay, so relatively quick game. Going back through the opening here, though, our opponent starts with d4. We go knight f6. And then they play the move a4. Not a good move. In the Benko Gambit course on Chessable, I don't mention this move, mainly because it's just not a very good move. You can play almost anything here as black, and you're going to be in very good shape. A move like d5, as I mentioned, is very good and solid. I decided to go for c5 to keep it a little bit more in the Benko Gambit realm of things. And you will find in a lot of the games that you're playing, especially if you're at this rating level, your opponents are going to be taking this pawn on c5 a lot of the time. It's not the best way to play. Usually the best way for white to play is to advance the pawn up to d5. That's probably what they should do in this kind of position. But when they take the pawn on c5, you're usually going to be able to win this pawn back without too much effort. In the game, we went for e6. He did defend the pawn for one move, but knight a6 is usually another good way of piling up on the pawn, especially when the opponent uses the bishop to defend it. We're going to take the pawn, and we're also preventing white from playing the move b4. That's kind of the main reason that knight to a6 is good. Another move that's also, I think, completely playable here is maybe knight to g4 or knight to d5. Both of these would also harass the bishop that is protecting the pawn. But I just decided to go for knight a6 here. We won the pawn back. We gained the bishop pair. And then this knight c3 move was a very big blunder. I think white could have played knight f3, e3. If they had done something like this and developed and castled on the king side, I think their position is worse for sure. But they're not losing material or completely lost at that point. But knight c3 is a big problem. It is an undefended piece on a lineup towards the opponent's king, so this is kind of where the spider senses, or spidey senses might kick in. So we go for queen a5. I think bishop b4 would have done essentially the same thing. But we go queen a5. We piled up on the knight that was pinned, won the knight, and then again, lots of moves are good here. You could just go ahead and castle and develop, but I decided to go for the checkmate threat. The opponent misses it, and we do get the win here. Okay, so that's it for this game. Let's go ahead and get into our next one. All right, so we have another game here playing against the move d4, playing against El Porritos, maybe is how you say that, but they're from France, so maybe my pronunciation or accent there is off. Okay, so d4, knight f6, c4. So far, this is going to be the first game where we're potentially getting into a Benko Gambit proper. We go for c5. They do play d5, and we are going for our Benko Gambit here. So we play the move b5. The entire idea behind the Benko Gambit is that you are potentially looking to sacrifice a couple of queenside pawns in order to pull away white's c4 pawn from protecting the center. And then the goal is once the c4 pawn has been traded off or eliminated, then you're usually trying to break apart the center that white has. So that's the usual idea, especially if white takes the pawn, we would play the move a6. In this case, though, white plays the move knight to c3. Instead of capturing the pawn, they're kind of giving us the option to capture them. While it is possible to capture white's pawn in this position, I think if we take the pawn, white can play the move e4. Usually they'll regain the pawn with their bishop pretty soon after that. And I'm not as big of a fan of those kind of positions, quite honestly. I think white gets good control over the center without us being able to counterattack the center too easily. So what I recommend in this position instead is to play the move pawn to b4. We attack the opponent's knight, and once the knight retreats or goes to the edge of the board, then we'll be able to play a quick move e6 to chip away at white's center. So the best move is probably just to go back to b1, quite honestly. I don't really think this knight c3 move is all that great in the first place. But there are some potential mistakes that white could make here. Depending on how our opponent plays, we might see that in the game. If they go knight to a4 or knight b1, we're going to play the move e6 to attack the center. And if they move the knight to b5, I might pose that position as a puzzle. Okay, so they didn't play it. If they had played knight to b5, it is a pretty common move I see at the lower rating level. It's also a very big blunder at the same time. If they had played knight to b5, we could have played the move a6, and the knight would have been trapped. Okay, so they do move the knight back to the b1 square. And I think here it's very important for us to attack white's center pretty quickly. If they get the chance, they can play knight to d2, e4, and kind of build a big space advantage in the middle of the board. So we're going to go for the move e6 right away, putting some pressure on this d5 pawn. And we're trying to do this before white gets the chance to chip away at our... before white gets the chance to build a bigger space advantage in the middle of the board. Okay, so they go for the move a3. Usually in these situations when we have the pawn up on the b4 square already, we aren't really in a rush to push it or take anything. I mean, okay, we'll take a knight on c3 if we can. But I'm definitely not in a rush to take the pawn on a3 because I really like the idea of dominating the knight that's on b1. I don't want to let white get that c3 square available once again. So I'm actually going to just leave the pawn on b4. If they want to take me, I'll take back, and that pawn will continue to be a bit annoying for white to deal with. So after this move a3, I think I'm just going to go ahead and take the pawn on d5. It's also possible to play like bishop b7 and pressure the pawn that way. I think that's also an entirely viable idea. Maybe at the end of the day, I think I am just going to go bishop b7. If we trade the pawns on d5 and then go bishop b7, sometimes there are ideas where white can play the move e4 and maybe sacrifice a pawn, take advantage of our king being in the center. Those lines are a little bit tricky sometimes. Maybe in this particular situation where white has no development going on, it's probably fine to go for. So yeah, I think I'm just going to go with bishop b7, though. Let's just pressure the pawn without opening up the game just yet. They do take the pawn on b4. I'm going to recapture that pawn. I think it is actually possible now that I'm looking at it. Maybe we could take on d5 first. But I'm just going to take the pawn back on b4. I like the idea of continuing to limit this knight. Here white plays the move queen a4, but this isn't really threatening anything. Our pawn on b4 is defended. And otherwise, white is just allowing us to take the pawn on d5. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and grab the pawn. They might have thought that the pawn was not protected. They might now be realizing that the bishop is protecting it. But it's a little bit too late to realize that because they have already lost the pawn on d5 at this point. So we're going to be up a pawn. I don't entirely know if I should take with the knight or the bishop. I'm leaning towards taking with the... Probably with the bishop is the one I think I might prefer here. Taking with the knight looks perfectly good as well, but maybe white gets to play a move like e4 and attack the knight. I'm going to take with the bishop here. Usually a bishop in the center of the board is a bit of a target to be attacked. Maybe white could play knight c3 in some situations, but the pawn on b4 really prevents that whole entire idea, and so I'm not really bothered by any knight c3 moves that white could try. So they do play bishop d2. They're really going after this pawn. As long as I keep this pawn defended, that pretty much means that the knight on b1 is going to just be completely out of the game. So knight to c6 or pawn to a5 both look good. Probably I'm just going to go knight to c6. Might as well develop a new piece. Don't really see any reason not to do that. Maybe we also have some knight to d4 ideas and jumping into the c2 square at some point down the road. So they play the move e3, okay? This really means that this bishop is stuck, this knight is stuck. Again, as long as we keep the pawn on b4 defended, white's going to have a lot of trouble here. So against the move e3, there's a couple of different routes we could go. Knight to e4 is one option in order to hit this bishop, maybe hit the f2 pawn, but I don't know if I'm really in a rush to take this bishop since it's really not that great of a piece for white. White also can't develop the bishop on f1 just yet because our bishop is putting pressure on the g2 pawn. If they do develop the bishop somewhere, we can take the pawn and then the rook in the corner will be trapped. So I think here I'm probably just going to focus on developing more pieces. Let's go ahead and just bring the bishop into the game. Bishop to c5 looks like a perfectly good move. And then we'll castle. And we'll have a big lead in development. We'll have an extra pawn. We'll be castled. White won't be. So it's looking like a very good position for black at this point. So I would not be surprised if they developed the bishop and blundered the g2 pawn, but probably a better move is to play knight f3 and block off the bishop's diagonal there. Okay, they do play knight f3. I'm just going to continue with my castling. I don't see anything overly special to do right away. I think I'll just castle. And maybe I'll play a move like a5 at some point just to overprotect or keep this pawn on b4 better defended. Probably around here is where I'll start thinking about that. If they take the knight, I'll take back. I will be hitting the queen, so I'm not really in danger of them taking the knight followed by taking the pawn since the bishop would hit the queen, but so a5 is reasonable. Queen b6 also looks pretty good. Maybe queen b6 is even a little bit better. Okay, we'll go queen b6 in this position. Put a little bit of pressure on the bishop. Maybe play a6 one day and see what white does. I'm not really in a rush necessarily to take the knight on f3. I do think it would be a absolutely good and fine move. But also at the same time, I really like my light square bishop, so not really in a rush to trade off that piece. So they did end up taking the knight. We can take back with the bishop to hit the queen. We can also take with the pawn, which would kind of open up an extra file in the center of the board. So I can take and gain tempo or gain time on the queen, or I can take with the pawn and just be happy with the way that the pieces and pawns are arranged. I don't really want to take with the queen, even though we are up a pawn and queen trades would be absolutely good to go for. The fact that we just have better pieces and safer king and all these kind of things combined together, I'm really leaning towards just keeping the queens on the board at this point. So bishop takes or pawn takes. I think I'm going to take with the bishop in this situation just to pressure the queen, see what white does. I might even be able to play bishop b5 and prevent the king from castling, depending on where they move the queen to. Okay, they go back to the b3 square. If I go bishop b5 here, I suppose white can take the pawn on b4, so I'm not in a rush to do that necessarily. I think I'll just push the a-pawn. Probably just push the pawn up the board. Now my b4 pawn is protected, so bishop to b5 is an idea. And it's also important to note that my queen is still protected here. So if white tries a move like knight c3, trying to take advantage of this pin, it doesn't really work the way they want it to because my queen would still be defended and I would have been able to take the knight. Okay, they play the move knight to e5. This does lose the pawn on g2. Even though taking the pawn does open up the opponent's rook a little bit, I think I'm still going to go for it because it does also strand white's king in the center. So I'm going to grab the pawn. They'll move the rook, I assume. I do have the pawn on f7 protected, so I'm not worried about that. I will bring this bishop back to pester the queen. This knight is protecting the bishop. So the queen will probably go to c2. And from there, I'll decide what to do, but we are up 2 pawns with a very nice position. The king in the, being stuck in the center of the board is definitely White's big problem that's occurring here. Okay, they go knight to e6, or sorry, not e6. They go knight to c4. They do block off the attack. However, the big problem here is they're also pinning their knight at the same time. So I can move the queen somewhere and attack the knight simultaneously. So b5, a6, and e6 all work. I think I'll just go for e6. I like the idea of also eyeing the king here. And I don't really see a way for White to deal with this knight that's pinned. There's no really good way for them to defend it a second time. If they use this knight to go to a3, I can just take that knight on a3. So this we kind of see that, you know, all the way back on this fourth move of the game when I pushed the pawn up to b4. This pawn on b4 was really a big thorn in White's side the entire game. Yeah, so here we're going to take the knight on c4. And then probably swing some rooks in the center, maybe push the d-pawn, try to open up the middle of the board where the king is. And White's going to be in tough shape here. So, hard to give advice at this point. Down a piece, down 2 pawns. I am also having ideas potentially. Okay, so they play b3. So they are trying to take advantage of this lineup of the bishops. If I do just simply move the bishop away or take the pawn, they will probably, I assume, take the bishop on c5. So I don't really want to give them that opportunity, of course. So there's actually a couple of ways we can work around this kind of tactic that White's trying. The one that I'm leaning towards, I think the simplest one here is just to move the bishop to the d4 square, counterattacking the rook on a1 and taking advantage of the pin on the e-file. They can't take my bishop because the king is there on e1. And if they, if they take the bishop on c4, I'll get the rook. And if they move the rook away, then my bishop will be able to move away freely at that point. So I think this is the simplest. Another option I was looking at was maybe queen to e5, attacking the h2 pawn and the rook. So very important in these positions where your opponent's making a threat, they're attacking you. It looks like they might even have a tactic that they're kind of executing on because of this pin on the c-file, pin or skewer, whichever one you want to call it. It's very important to look for counterattacking moves rather than just automatic defensive moves first. Very important to look for counterattacking moves to begin with. Because, yeah, in this position, I take the pawn on b3, I fork the queen and the rook, and once the queen moves, we take the rook, and we're just going to win more and more material here. I'm also down to about a minute, so I'll probably have to speed up on time, but for the most part, it's all about just playing with the extra material, converting the advantage, trading pieces, and finishing the game off. Also, now that I have 2 passed pawns on the queen side, I can also just work on pushing these pawns down the board, and that's going to be very difficult for White to deal with. So again, always important, even if you have a very large advantage, if your opponent's fighting back, they're trying little tactics, they're trying to attack you, still have to play precisely. You don't want to just fall asleep at the wheel and think the game is going to win itself. You have to still play as accurately as you can, stay awake, so to speak, and make sure that you're doing the best job you can to finish the game off. So we're just going to take essentially everything that he's given me. He's going to probably move the knight to d2. Finally gets to move the knight back into the game, but it's essentially 15 moves later. Here I think the simplest thing, I'll just take the rook, or not the rook. Sorry, I'll take the knight. Now I will come down and pin the queen on the back rank. My bishop does guard. And yeah, we have way too much time on the clock for him to feel like he can turn the game in his favor here, or win on time. We're just going to bring the rook to the open file. Guess I'll take this pawn here. Always good to note also, whenever your opponent makes a move, you ask yourself, what did their recent move change about the position? And that's generally a good question to ask yourself. So I'm just giving a couple of checks. Here I'll activate the rook, try to check on the e4 square. And yeah, checkmate is going to be incoming. Kind of hard for him to do much about it at this point. I am playing these games in this speedrun using the 10-minute rapid rating category, you could say, on chess.com. I would generally advise trying to have an increment with your games, depending on the level of rating that you're at. Okay, I'll just take the rook there. Now, I do need to make sure I don't stalemate my opponent here. I'll just play queen f4, making sure that he has 2 moves available for his king. Check here, and checkmate here. Okay, so we got the win. Let's go back to the start of the game and analyze. So he starts off with d4. We do actually get fairly close to a Benko Gambit proper. If he had taken the pawn on b5, we would play the move a6. And this is the basis, I would say, of my course on Chessable. They take both pawns. We play this move e6, which is not a very common move. The most common move in this position is g6 or bishop takes a6, and usually black puts the bishop on g7. But what I recommend in the course I have on Chessable is the move e6, looking to strike at the center pretty quickly, a lot more quickly than you normally would in most Benko Gambit openings. But this particular opponent doesn't take the pawn. They played the move knight c3 instead. And yeah, the best move here is to push to b4. We do advance, we kick the knight, and we kind of saw in the game that this knight really had a hard time getting back into the game. We tried to open up the position in the center of the board pretty quickly. Our opponent does end up losing the pawn. And not only have they lost the pawn, but again, very hard for them to develop their pieces the way they want to. Can't develop the f1 bishop without losing the g2 pawn. Can't develop the knight without running into, getting captured on c3 or a3. And if they go knight to d2, then they're also in the way of the bishop, which is not fantastic. So as the game went on, I really just wanted to make sure that my b4 pawn was well supported, improve the pieces, gain more space. Our opponent ends up kind of giving away an extra pawn and then walking into this pin. And once they lost the piece, I think that this moment right here was pretty important. We are up a piece, but our opponent is trying to counterattack here. If I was to rush and just say, oh, I can take the pawn on b3 because my queen is protecting, he would go ahead and take the bishop on c5. It is still a much better position for black. We're still up 3 pawns with the big advantage. But rather than doing that, it's even better to look for counterattacking moves that are, trying to work around the opponent's ideas and tactics that they're going for. And in this position, we hit the rook in the corner first, then got the pawn, and only now are we taking it because there's no bishop on c5 to capture. And of course, we're also forking the queen and the rook as we saw in the game. So we took all the material here, just using some little small tactics, and eventually got the checkmate a little bit later down the road. Okay, so that's it for this game. Let's get into the next one. So here's our next game. Against d4, we're going for knight f6. We'll see if they play c4. They decide not to, though. They go for the move d5 in this position. So against the move d5, which is, first of all, not a terribly great move, it does push the pawn forward. It does gain a little bit of extra space in the center of the board, but this pawn is also a little bit overextended into our half of the board here. We could either go for e6 or c6. Both of these are going to chip away at the pawn. I'm leaning a bit more towards e6 because this also opens up the bishop on the f8 square. So I think that's what I'm going to go for. I'm going to go for, let's say, pawn to e6. White could go c4 or knight to c3. Both of these would protect the pawn on d5. They go for knight to c3, okay. In response to knight c3, it is possible to take the pawn on d5 and have them recapture. But I think what I like a little bit more is I'm going to go for the move bishop to b4, pinning the knight. And now because the knight is pinned, we are threatening to take the pawn on d5 here. So white's best move is probably now to go ahead and take our pawn on e6. And we will probably recapture with the f-pawn if they do that. Okay, this particular opponent decides to play the move bishop to g5. They are pinning the knight, so if I take the pawn, they will take my queen, which is not a good idea. There are sometimes some tricks associated with taking pawn and then taking the knight and taking back, and then white actually has no good way to block the check without blocking with their queen, and that would actually end up being good for us. We would win material there. I think the issue, though, is that if we take the pawn, they get the queen, we take on c3. They don't have to recapture on c3. They can move the queen away, and kind of gets awkward and probably not very good for us at that point. So what I'm going to do, though, instead is I'm actually just going to take the pawn with the pawn rather than using the knight. And if white takes with their queen, then I'll take their queen, and I'll end up winning material, because the problem for white is here that their knight is what you could call kind of like an absolute pin. They can't move the knight even if they wanted to. Whereas my knight is in what you could call a relative pin. So I can move the knight if I want to. It'll cost me my queen, whereas white cannot move the knight even if they wanted to. So it's actually good here to just simply capture the queen. They will get my queen. Now I have two options. I can take the bishop on d8, and I would simply be ahead a piece, or I can take the knight on c3 first. I don't know if it makes a huge difference between the two, to be quite honest with you. I think I'll just take the bishop. And then I am up a piece. I have 4 minor pieces to my opponent's 3. And I'm also threatening to take the knight on c3 next move. So they end up castling. I'll take the knight at this point. They will recapture. I will take with my bishop. And yeah, we're just up an entire piece. We're also up a pawn at the same time. Very good position for us in black shoes. So let's just continue developing some pieces. Knight goes to c6. They play knight g5. They are attacking this pawn on f7. As I've said in other videos and in other games, very important that even if you have a very large advantage and have a winning position, you still have to be very aware or on the lookout for what the opponent's trying to do with their moves. So we don't want to just autopilot here and just play, I don't know, like b6 and try to develop the bishop, because we would let them execute their threat. So we want to guard this pawn. I don't want to use the rook, because then I would lose the pawn on h7. So I think I am just going to move the king up to e7 to protect the pawn for now. e8 would also be fine, but let's go to e7. That way we can get off the back rank. You do not want to push the pawn, because even though pushing the pawn would move the pawn away from being captured, they could still go into the f7 square and give the check. So that would be bad news for us. White decides to move the rook up the board, attacking our bishop. I'm going to go ahead and retreat the bishop. Let's go back here and attack the knight. Probably the knight goes in the center, is my guess. And from there, I'll probably focus on developing my queenside bishop and trying to get the rest of my pieces in the game. Remember, if you're ahead material but you don't actually use the extra pieces, then it's not really like you're ahead material in the first place. So if you are ahead material, you need to put those pieces to use and get them in the game. Okay, so they give a check. I need to keep the protection of this f7 pawn. I don't want to go to d8 and walk into a checkmate. That would be very, very sad. So we're going to go back to the f8 square, keep the pawn defended, and we're still attacking the knight at the same time. So probably now it does move away. I could play the move d5. I don't really mind white trading these pieces, because I am up a piece, so trading is generally fine for me. I think I'm just going to do that. I don't really mind that it's going to be doubled pawns all that much. If they do take, okay, I have doubled pawns, but I'm getting one of white's most active pieces off of the board. I'm also totally fine with that. And then again, I can just develop all the pieces, get the rooks in the game, get the bishop in the game. And it's also kind of awkward for white to develop their bishop, since the rook is blocking the e-pawn at this point. White goes for rook to g3. I'm just going to go... I could go rook g8 and just offer another trade of pieces. Probably I'll just do that. I don't see why not. They go for the trade. Fine by me. Let's also develop the bishop to a active location, put some pressure on the c2 pawn. Maybe a move like knight to b4 is an idea at the right time in order to attack white's pieces. Okay, they go bishop d3. Taking the bishop does kind of fix their pawn structure. They won't have an isolated pawn anymore. But at the same time, getting pieces off of the board is just going to be such a good thing for the player who's ahead a piece and a pawn. So from here, I could go knight b4 and attack both pawns. I don't really see a reason not to do it. I could potentially get the knight a little bit stuck and stranded though on the a2 square if I'm not careful. I think for that reason, what I'm going to do is, I think I'll just start. I'm gonna get my king over towards the queen side first. This is where I have extra pawns. I have 3 pawns versus my opponent's 1 pawn on the queen side. I'm eventually going to start pushing these pawns and trying to create a pass pawn in the near future. So let's get the king off the back rank. Maybe I'll swing the rook over to the g file. Maybe I'll just attack that pawn real quick first of all. They're probably going to play the move g3 to keep it safe. Let's play the move h6. We'll just lock this pawn in place. Maybe one day we can play rook g5 to attack it. And now I'll start pushing the pawns on the queen side here. Let's go for pawn to b5. They go for e4, okay. If I take the pawn, they might take with check. I don't think it's really that big of a deal, but that being said, I'll just go for d4. Keep this side of the board kind of locked up, and mostly try to play over on the queen side part of the board. It's also the case here where these pawns are kind of immobilized. Pretty much all of white's pawns are immobilized here. If they push the f pawn, they will lose the g3 pawn. If they push the g pawn, I might jump into the center and attack a couple of things. Let's go ahead now, I suppose, and just centralize the knight and attack the pawn. Probably white plays king c2 to guard it. Let's continue pushing the pawns over on the queen side. And eventually we're going to try to create a pass pawn, or more than one pass pawn, and try to win in that half of the board here. Okay, they go for a3. Let's just keep pushing pawns. Could have pushed c4 right away as well, but okay, we can just push all the pawns. Plays the move f4, attacking my knight. Lots of moves are good. I think given the circumstance, I think I'm just going to actually give up the knight. Let white take the knight, but I'll get the pawn on g3 with check afterwards. And then I can also pick up the pawn on a3 once the king retreats. So sometimes when you're ahead material, sometimes you're going to be able to give that piece up or give that material up in order to gain other advantages, or to just kind of trade off certain things. Like I can give the knight up and win 1, 2, 3 pawns in the process, and these extra pawns are going to be very big problem for white to deal with here. So they push e5. Doesn't really bother me all that much. I'm going to go for, I think I'm actually going to go for f5. Let's just kind of lock everything up. And then I'll just play c4, b4, check, push all the pawns. Not a whole lot white can do to stop my pawn avalanche. So c4. I can throw in the check here if I want, and then just push the d pawn down the board. This b4 and rook a2 is not checkmate yet. That being said, I'll just kind of keep the king kind of stuck in this little box. The king is immobilized. I do have to be a little bit careful here. If white plays a move like rook h2, this could be kind of a little bit of a fancy stalemate idea. However, the big problem here is it's not ever actually going to be stalemate because he always has the ability to push this pawn. So here, for example, if I take the rook, I don't know if he was trying for a stalemate or not, but if I take the rook, it's not a stalemate. The king can't move, but he does have pawns that can move. So it's not actually stalemate. He has to move one of these pawns. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to throw in the check with b4, force the king to move, and then we're never going to be worried about stalemate anymore because the king has enough safe squares to move to. I'm just going to push the pawn. We can block the pawns now. It's not stalemate. He has these 2 squares for the king available. Always good when you have such a large material advantage. Be very careful that you're not accidentally stalemating the opponent or leaving them with no moves. Always have to think about what the opponent's going to play with their move themselves. And if they have no move that they can play, that's a bad sign. If they literally and physically have no move they can play, you don't want to let that happen because then it would be a stalemate problem. But yeah, we got the job done here. We got the win. Let's go back and analyze it from the start. So d4, knight f6, white goes for d5. I don't really know how common of a move this is. I can't really imagine that many people are playing it. But at the same time, it's good to have an idea of what to do against this. It does take us out of our kind of Benko Gambit wheelhouse, you could say, because normally we're trying to play the move c5 against most of White's second move options. If they play d5, I guess technically you could play c5 here if you wanted to. If they play c4, then you do get to transpose into a Benko Gambit. So technically, that would have been a fine option as well. But generally, I like to try to not autopilot the openings. I try to kind of maximally exploit or punish my opponent's mistakes that they make in the beginning of the game if they do make those mistakes. So here I like this idea of going e6, knight c3. We pinned the knight. We won the pawn in the center. And we saw in the game how, because we're kind of punishing White's opening play, it snowballs into them making another mistake, which is this queen takes d5 move, which is a big mistake. And then we're able to win the queen. And, well, we're not up a queen, but we are up an entire bishop in this position. And we were able to snowball the extra piece into a win pretty quickly. So, trade stuff, defend against the opponent's threats, play safe responses or defenses or reactions to their threats once again. We're happy to trade pieces. Our pawns are a little bit shattered after all of this, but again, we're happy to trade pieces. And then ultimately, down the road, you want to prioritize the side of the board where you have your advantage. So we do have an extra knight, so in that regard, you can kind of play on any side of the board, but we are also up a pawn at the same time, and our extra pawn is over on the queen side. This is where we have a 4 versus 2 pawn majority advantage. And usually you want to play, in most positions, you want to play where your pawn majority is. So we have 2 extra pawns on the queen side. We want to play on the queen side. Do we have anything advantageous on the king side? Not really. I mean, we have the extra knight, of course, but if we didn't have the extra knight, especially, it really wouldn't make any sense to play on the king side. So we want to play on the queen side where we have the pawn majority, the extra pawn. That's the way we want to do things here. And I ultimately decided to give the knight up for a couple of pawns. Now we're just ahead 4 pawns without even the knight being on the board. And eventually we do push those queenside pawns. Eventually they resigned, but I was going to make a queen and get the win. So that's going to be it for this third game in the video. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed these couple of games, featuring games played against players between the rating range of 600 all the way up to 800. This particular opponent was 732. So the next video in the series is going to focus on games against d4 using the Benko Gambit repertoire when our opponents are over the rating of 800. So hopefully you'll look forward to the next video. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. I'll see you in the next one then.